Good morning. Today's lecture is on women in medieval Christianity. So this is the part of the course where we look at a period of about 1,000 years, from about 500 of the Common Era to about 1500. In this course, we've covered a lot of time. We've covered women in prehistory. We've covered women and religious figures in the third millennium before the Common Era and the second millennium. So the area of Mesopotamia, the cultures of Sumer and Akkad. We looked at the Enuma Elish. Then we looked at women's religion and goddesses in Greece, Rome, and Egypt in the first millennium before the Common Era. Then we looked at Judaism. Then we looked at women in Christianity. Then we looked at women in Islam. And the century where we primarily worked with women in Islam was the 7th century, the era when Muhammad lived. Now we looked at women in Judaism up through around 600. So for women in Christianity in the medieval period, as I said, the time frame will be about 500 to about 1500. So before we get into who these wonderful women were, I want you to have in front of you a timeline and perhaps just sketch in your own timeline so that you'll know when the medieval period was. That would be a good place to start. So we know that Rome fell to the invading Vandals and other tribes in the year 410, that the Roman Empire struggled along for another 50, 100 years. But after the Roman Empire fell, the means of communication were very limited, the means of travel, so all the beautiful roads that the Romans had built and the aqueducts and libraries and centers of government were now getting isolated, and people were not able to communicate. And the places where learning was held together was in monasteries. So this whole period from, say, roughly 500 to 1500, there was less communication and less access to literacy and to books than there had been in previous centuries. The events that caused the end of the medieval period are, for one thing, the first printing with the printing press. So the printing of the Gutenberg Bible in 1453 in Germany is one marker that changed the world forever. Instead of hand copying out everything that you wanted to communicate with anyone outside your immediate area, you could print. You could make many more copies, reach many more people. Another event that precipitated the end of the medieval world was the voyages of Columbus and other discoverers who just traveled and discovered the exact dimensions of the world. So 1492, the date when we remember Columbus. Another event that was critical in ending the way the medieval world had been was the activity of Martin Luther, 1517, in Wittenberg, Switzerland, when he nailed his criticisms of the Roman Catholic Church to a door and announced that he was going to do things differently, and a lot of Protestants protesting certain things they disagreed with in the church started forming their own denominations. So that's the beginning and the end of the medieval period. What we're going to do today is fill in some of the key women and their accomplishments that happened in that period of 1,000 years. Before we put the women in, let's put in on your personal timeline whatever dates you know. So in this course, we've noted the death of St. Augustine and his activities, actually. His death in 430, so he lived to see the fall of Rome and lived a fair amount of years after it. The other date that most people know is 1066, the Battle of Hastings, when the Normans invaded England and conquered England, and William of Normandy set up a government that was including both England and France. Another lesser known fact for that same century, the 11th century, is that was a century when there was a battle within the church to try to get everybody to observe the ideal of celibacy for priests. So in previous centuries, this had been kind of haphazard. Some places required it, other places didn't. But there was a campaign to get this set up as a real enforced ideal in the 11th century. And by 1123, the First Lateran Council also set up a law forbidding marriage for priests. So it's important for women in this era to know that that church leaders in Christianity were not as isolated from the normal human life involving men and women prior to this century, the 11th century, as they have been in the last 1,000 years. So priests were more likely to be married, to have families, to have interaction with women. And in the next 5 or 6 centuries especially, it was very possible for someone like St. Thomas Aquinas to be raised in a monastery, to have virtually no contact with women, and then when he was writing documents and describing women and ideals of what women could or couldn't do and what they should be doing, he was really out of touch with who women were. So let's see, another date that most people can put in is the Crusades. So beginning in the 12th century and extending as late as the early 13th century, we had these efforts by Christians to recover land in the Middle East that had belonged to Christianity or that they felt should. So Muslim empires were in control of that area, so there were these battles for control of the Holy Lands. So let's start putting some women into this calendar, into this timeline. So I'll just throw out some names, and we'll get to some important women, but I'll throw out some others just for you to know that there were women writing, thinking, being active in Christianity in these centuries. So a book that I'd like to recommend to everyone is Medieval Women's Visionary Literature by Elizabeth Alvita Petroff. So she has collected a lot of documents written by women, primarily related to having visions or having contact with God in either messages, voices, or experiences of some kind, and then writing about it. So I'm going to first introduce you to Saint Leoba, who was born in Wessex, England in 700 approximately, and died in 770 of the Common Era. She was very well educated, could read and write Latin, read the Bible, knew the church fathers, all the writings of the early Christian leaders. She knew law. She was one of the women who went as a missionary to Germany with St. Boniface to try to convert those pagans over in Germany. So this is all happening in the 8th century. She did not actually write her own life, or we don't have documents. We didn't inherit documents from her, but we learn in the life written about her after she died, written by a monk, called The Life of Saint Leoba. We learn that she had a monastery in Germany, and she defended her community against the charge of one of them becoming pregnant and killing a newborn. And so this was a charge that was made against her community. She defended her community against it. We learned that she did miracles, including calming a storm, as Jesus did. We know that Charlemagne and other kings of the Franks and Germans respected her. So here's an important woman living in the 8th century. The next woman I want to mention is Rotsvit of Gandersheim. She lived 932 to the year 1000 of the Common Era. She's the earliest known poet in Germany, male or female. She wrote dramas and legends of saints. She studied earlier church history and wrote about martyrs and early saints. Let's also mention Duoda, who was the wife of Bernhard of Septimania. This is in 824. She was married, and we have records of her her births and what happened with her and her children, primarily because she wrote them. So at this point, I would like to mention this book, Medieval Women Writers, and I would like to notice that Duoda, a Frankish woman, that is in the area now called France, is the first woman listed in this book. And so we know some things about her because of a text that she wrote to her children. For her son William, she was separated from some of her children. Her husband had complete control over them, and she was more or less kept under control in a castle while her husband was often traveling. And so she wrote this manual for her son. So we learn a lot about her life and about her care for her children. Let's move now to one of my favorite early women, and she lives in the 12th century. Her name is Christina of Markiet. She's in England. She was a young English woman who was beaten and forced into a marriage by her parents. She escaped, however, from that marriage, doing things like hiding behind the curtain of the bedroom and just refusing to have anything to do with the man she was supposed to marry, who was actually not as educated and as interested in religious things as she was. It was a pretty poor match, but it was economically a good alliance as her family saw it and his family saw it, and that was how marriages were made in those times. Anyway, she escaped, and she lived with an anchoress named Alfwin in a secret compartment for 2 years until finally she was released from her marriage. She also lived in a corner of the room of an old hermit named Roger. And when she was released from her marriage, which never really was a marriage, then she became a nun of a small convent called St. Albans. So we have the life of Christina of Markiet, and that was written because she and her struggles, her visions, and her holiness became famous. So she's an interesting woman who lived 1096 to 1160 of the Common Era. So 12th century. So the most famous person living in that century was Hildegard of Bingen. So I'd like to introduce you to her. Many of you have probably already heard of her. She was a German visionary and abbess of a double monastery. So it was a women's monastery with a men's monastery next to it. And the men's monastery was essentially serving the women's monastery. They needed priests, they needed to have communion, and I don't know what else they needed other than that the women couldn't do. But for that reason, there were double monasteries, and Hildegard was the head of this double monastery. And her dates are 1098 to 1179 of the Common Era, so 12th century woman. And actually I'm wearing a t-shirt from her that's about her. The t-shirt says, "Before there was a Renaissance man, there was a medieval woman." So this is from a conference of at Cal State Fullerton, the Women's Center. There was a conference of women's studies, and this t-shirt happened to be the theme for that particular year. This was maybe about 1998 or something like that. Anyway, a Renaissance man is someone who can do just about anything, can paint, maybe do a little science, maybe be interested in architecture or engineering, and be interested in poetry and writing. So somebody who can do a lot of things in different areas, but all interested in knowledge and in achievement, would be called a Renaissance man. And we still use that term today. Oh, he's such a Renaissance man. Well, this t-shirt says, there was a person who was accomplished in a number of areas, and she lived in the medieval period. She was a medieval woman. And before we even had the term of the Renaissance and the idea of a Renaissance man, there was a medieval woman named Hildegard of Bingen. So let's talk about some of her achievements. She's famous just for her wide learning and her reading. This would be in Latin. Everything would be in Latin. Her art, her music. She also wrote a drama kind of an early opera. So she just entered a lot of genres, as well as politics and administration of her very influential abbey. She's known in her writing for her emphasis on God's creation and on the blessing of the earth, as opposed to having an emphasis on salvation in Jesus Christ and the death of Jesus, and that is the central point of our faith. So within Christianity, you can focus either on Jesus and Jesus' death and resurrection, or you can focus on the creation and God's relationship with humans at the beginning of life. So creation and salvation are two poles. She preferred to emphasize the first pole. When you emphasize that, you're really emphasizing God's blessings, God's love for humanity, and you're not focusing on humans' sinfulness and on the need for redemption and Jesus' rather gory execution. So this is, she's famous for being the first person to really emphasize greenness and the blessings of a green earth and caring for the earth. She had a lot of medical ideas about how to provide for the health of her nuns and monks, and things like having plumbing within the monastery to have little channels for waste and for water, and so even agriculture, she had some ideas about that. So she was a pretty interesting woman. The other thing that she's really famous for is being a strong voice advising the Pope at that time, and also advising Bernard of Clairvaux and others through her letters. So she wrote a lot of letters. These letters were delivered. She got answers back, and she was a real voice, challenging the popes and trying to get them to be a little more like Jesus, a little more biblical. She also had visions. She wrote long accounts of her visions, and one of the visions is one of the important works of literature that she wrote is called Scivias, or Know the Ways. So know the ways of the Lord. She had an experience where a voice from heaven said to her, "Cry aloud, therefore, and write thus." And so she started writing. And she just ended up having a lot of visions and a lot of writings. In her writings, there are different themes, such as praising the Virgin Mary rather than emphasizing the sin of Eve. And when she praises the Virgin Mary, she stresses that Mary's beautiful life lived in reverence for God and in obedience and closeness to Jesus, being the mother of Jesus, elevates all women. So let's not talk so much about how all women are similar to Eve. Let's talk about how all women are like Mary, was an emphasis that she made. So here's a line from one of her writings. She writes, and this is translated to English. Speaking of Mary, she says, "She has honored and ordained heaven far more than women earlier disordered earth." So woman has done more through Mary than women per se, or quote unquote, disordered the earth through the first sin in the Garden of Eden. So she's an interesting person. Here's one of her books, Hildegard of Bingen's Book of Divine Works, with some of her letters and songs. And this one is edited by Matthew Fox, who was very much influenced by her and has a center for study and for creation theology in Oakland. I want to show you some of her art. So, many of her pieces of art have an oval shape, a circular or oval shape. And she actually would have a vision of one of these themes, whatever the particular content of the message was, and then she would communicate it to the nuns in her monastery and maybe sketch it out. And they would end up working for months on making a beautiful painting with the full details and elegance and color of the vision that she described. So this is one of them. Here's an artwork describing her at work in getting a vision. So you can see that above her there are some lines coming down from the ceiling or the sky, and she's kind of looking up, and she's sitting at a desk and writing or drawing, I can't tell which. And here's a little monk here watching her. So going, oh. So this is her in a monastery working. So that's a self-portrait by Hildegard, actually. I don't know if there was a self-portrait by a woman in art before her. This is a typical one of her artistic pieces. This is the universe. She had a vision where the universe was like an egg, and it had different layers of stars around it, and then there are clouds, and on the inside there's earth, or there's the human. I think it's just, I don't know if she knew for sure that the earth was a round planet, but at any rate, in her vision, it definitely was. So this is a typical part of her art, and here's this whole book on it is called The Illuminations of Hildegard of Bingen by Matthew Fox. He edited this. Here's another one that I like a lot, and this is Sophia, Mother Wisdom, Mother Church. So in this vision, she saw God holding the church and holding women in particular, and the women in her convent, in her arms or wings or something. So this larger portion of the picture shows Sophia, or Mother Wisdom. So the figure that's in Proverbs and in other parts of the Bible where God is represented or is seen as a female figure, Chokhmah, or Sophia, whether you speak in Hebrew or in Greek. So there is Sophia, there are the women nuns, and they're praising God. And so that's a wonderful vision of the church and Mother Church. And so two female figures, the church as a female and wisdom as a female. And those are of course just metaphors. So anyway, Hildegard of Bingen, a fascinating person. Let's move now to a movement of women in the 13th through 18th centuries, which is a movement called the Beguines. This is an informal group of holy women who lived together in various communities from the 13th to the 18th centuries in northern France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and in Germany. So these women earned their own money, usually through the cloth industry, weaving, doing some sorts of handiwork. And so they could earn their own living. They lived together in homes, and they were known for their devotion to Jesus in the Eucharist and their dedication to simple living and to poverty. So they weren't trying to get rich. They weren't business women with a profit emphasis. But it made the church very nervous that they were living together, not in marriage and not in a convent. The church wanted them to be controlled. There were various bishops and archbishops who tried to get different communities of these women to take vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, to be shut up in convents. But these women, this is at the same time that movements such as the Franciscans and the Dominicans were being traveling preachers in the streets. And these women said, we don't want to be in convents. We just want to serve God and live together and live a simple life. But because the church was nervous about them, many of them were accused of heresy, and quite a number of them were executed as witches. So I'll tell you about two of the most well-known Beguines now. One is Hadgewick of Brabant. She lived in the first half of the 13th century. She was Flemish. She was well educated in Latin and literature, and including literature that was about courtly love, and including some sciences like the science of astronomy, and educated also in music. She wrote many letters, poems, and reports of her visions. She had 14 visions. Her ideas about the love of God are blended with ideas about courtly love and human love between men and women. So there's an interesting mix in her writing of love of God, between men and women. One example is a document she wrote called Letters to a Young Beguine, where she explains her experiences, visions, her beliefs. So she was an interesting figure. Another was Mechthild of Magdeburg, and she lived from 1207 to 1282 of the Common Era. She was German. She was an outspoken critic of corruption in the church. She wrote poetry and prose. She too blended courtly love and religious language about love for God. She finally was forced to join a convent, probably for safety, so that she wouldn't be persecuted and perhaps lose her life. Her main work is called The Flowing Light of the Godhead, and there is dialogue in it between the soul, who is represented as a queen, and love, who represents God. So the soul is talking to love. This queen is speaking to love, and it's a beautiful, beautiful dialogue. Two of the most prominent Italian religious women of this period were St. Clare of Assisi and Catherine of Siena. St. Clare of Assisi was a friend of Francis of Assisi. She too wanted to be a mendicant, traveling preacher, working for Jesus in the streets and ministering to the people, but the church was not comfortable with that. She lived from 1196 to 1253. When Francis founded the Brotherhood, serving the poor, traveling preachers who did not live in a monastery, she was also made a commitment to that simple life, and she became dedicated to Lady Poverty, which is the ideal that Francis followed. She wanted to live like Jesus, serving the poor and owning no property, but the church did not feel comfortable about her and her fellow nuns with this kind of lifestyle out in the streets and not married and not controlled. So she was forced. She and her sisters, who were following Francis and that lifestyle with her, were forced to live like other nuns, confined in a convent, and to accept a rule, so a guideline for their conventual life. She fought to have her own version of the rule for her order, so she wrote letters back and forth, and she wrote a text called the Testament of St. Clare, and some of the themes in that are commitment to Our Lady, Most Holy Poverty. The strength of the bond between Clare and Francis is a prominent theme in that document, and commitment to Jesus, to the Virgin Mary, and to the Church is another important theme. So you'll probably be noticing that one of the things that all these women have in common is their visions. So for women in the medieval period within Christianity, the main source of power and identity is having visions. So often these visions included a call by God or the Holy Spirit to do a certain kind of work, but they probably couldn't get recognition within the church or by the local priest or bishop or archbishop without saying, God told me, this is from God, I had a vision. So I'm not saying that they said that for a reason, but that these visions that they experienced gave them access to a kind of power that they otherwise did not have in this society. Let's talk about another famous woman who lived in the same period. Well, actually, she's a little later. So St. Clare is early 13th century. So she's born in 1196 lived to 1253. About 100 years later in Italy, we have Catherine of Siena. She had a huge impact on the Catholic popes of her day. One of the most famous things is her letter to Pope Gregory XI. She had a very short life, 33 years, but here are some of the key events in her life. She had visions early in her life and a mystical marriage to Jesus before age 15. So she vowed her life to Jesus. Jesus will be my bridegroom. I will not marry. So this was the same thing that we remember from Christina of Marquette. She did not want to marry. She wanted to be a nun, an anchoress, and Catherine of Siena took this same route. She also had a very ascetic lifestyle, A-S-C-E-T-I-C. That means she went in for a lot of fasting, prayers, even flagellation or hitting herself to punish the body, and the refusal to marry. So she gave up sexuality. At age 17, she got smallpox and became disfigured. Living in her parents' home, she decided to become a third order Dominican. So the Dominicans were the order of preachers founded by St. Dominic, and she joined it as a third order. So she didn't actually enter a convent, but became the degree of involvement called third order. She always wanted to preach and to travel. She did end up preaching, and she became very involved in politics. Through her letters, she convinced Gregory XI to move back to Rome from the luxury of Avignon, France. So this was a period when there was a schism in the church. So there was an election for the next pope, and one man won and another one lost, but they both felt they had won, and the papacy moved to France from Rome. So part of the ones who followed Gregory XI moved to Avignon, France, and lived there in great palace and luxury. And the ones who felt that their candidate had won stayed in Rome, in the area we now call the Vatican. So she just felt this was a huge blot in the reputation of the church, that they couldn't even elect the next pope without fighting over it, and that they were so involved in a life of luxurious clothing and food and lifestyle and leisure. So she preached about the unity of the church and faithfulness to Jesus, and she did convince him to move back to Rome. She also worked with the sick and needy. She received the stigmata, the mysterious wounds on the palms of her hands, like those of Jesus nailed on the cross. So this was a mysterious gift that some medieval mystics got, and she received that and became famous for it. She died at age 33, probably from working with the sick and needy. A lot of people in the church who have done that have had shorter lives. Here are some samples of the advice she gives in her letters. She wrote a letter to a sister Daniela, who probably was also a Dominican. She said, "Use discretion, don't be so ascetic. Do eat meat when you're sick." So even though she was probably anorexic in her rejection of food and luxurious living, she advised Sister Daniela, don't be so extreme in your asceticism. Go ahead and eat meat if you're sick. To a friend, Father Raymond, she wrote, "I want to see you." And she said, "When Niccolo T was beheaded, I comforted him." So this was a dangerous time when there was inquisition happening and people were getting executed for various things. To Pope Gregory XI, she wrote things like, "What a shame for the church, priests and administrators living in luxury." So she has some wonderful letters, and she became very powerful and influential in her 33 years. Another disturbing phenomenon in early 14th century France, and also generally the Netherlands and that area, was the persecution of religious women. So in 1317, Pope John the 22nd declared that the idea of apostolic apostolic poverty was heresy. He didn't like the Beguines and other religious women living together, but not in convents. So the church began to persecute them, and this was again part of the Inquisition. So if you wanted to live in poverty and serve Jesus and go out and preach or work for the sick, you couldn't really do that unless you were a nun with vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience living in a convent. And once you were in a convent, you weren't likely to be out in the streets doing social work or education or health work. So this was a big dispute between women who wanted to do this in the church, and some women were executed. So I'm going to tell you about two women who were executed, whose names are still well known today. One is Na Prus Bonetta. She was burned at the stake in 1325 in Montpellier, southern France. She was committed to the poverty of Jesus as in the Gospels. That was her ideal. She had visions, and her beliefs and visions are recorded in the trial that she underwent during the Inquisition of the years 1315 through 1325. So for 10 years she was on trial off and on, she was questioned, she was harassed, and finally in 1325 she was burned at the stake. She believed that she was the herald of a new age, and there's possible some evidence that she even believed that she was the Holy Spirit. It's not clear to what extent she believed what, because our only records are from this trial, and the trial was pretty determined to convict her and get rid of her. Another one who was burned at the stake was Marguerite Porete. She was burned in 1310 in Paris. She was a Beguine from Belgium. She wrote a book called The Mirror of Simple Souls in 1306. It was a dialogue between love and reason about the soul. The book was burned, but it was very popular. More copies of it kept turning up. She spoke and taught publicly, but she refused to submit to the church, that is, to the orders of local bishops and priests. Her book was addressed to women, so her execution became a threat to all women who were like her. They held her up as an example. You know, if you keep following in this way without going into a convent, without marrying, you'll be executed too. So those are two examples of women who suffered during the persecution of religious women in 14th century. And both of these were burned at the stake in France. So let's turn to happier figures. Let's look at Julian of Norwich, who lived from 1343 to 1413 in England. She was an anchoress who lived next door to a church, praying and counseling people. So let's just define what an anchorite or anchoress is. Choir in Latin is cor or chorus. So anacorita means without a choir. So she was a nun who lived without a bunch of other sisters. She lived by herself, praising God and doing the prayers suggested throughout the religious observance of the day. So anchoress or anchorite is without a choir, or someone who lives alone like a hermit. The difference between an anchorite, whether it's male or female, and a nun or a monk is that the nun or monk would live together with other nuns or monks. But the anchorite, whether male or female, would live alone. If you lived out in the woods, you might be called a hermit or an anchorite, but probably a hermit. And probably only men were really able or allowed to live out in the woods. So if a woman wanted to live alone and devote her full time to prayer, she would usually live next door to a church. And she would have a window into the church where she could receive communion. She would have a window where someone would provide her with her meals, and she could put her dishes in and out. And she would also have a window where she would counsel people from the community. She would hear prayer requests and then pray for people and also counsel them. So to become an anchoress, you basically had to have an income. You had to have a donation from your family or from a wealthy person of some sort to be able to be an anchoress. Usually you would have a room by yourself with these windows, and then you would have someone who lived next to you in a small house or something, who was your housekeeper and cook and ran your errands for you. So an anchoress was supposed to never leave her one room. To become an anchoress, there was a ceremony where you made your vows, and one of the vows you made was place steadfastness, or studa stavelfastnessa, place steadfastness. So I'm going to stay in this place. That's a vow I make to God. I'm not going to run around and see everything in the world. I'm just going to focus on God by staying in one place and praying a lot. So there was a ceremony where they would wall in the door, or they would brick it in and fill it up as you made your vows. And from then on, you were officially the community's anchoress, in prayer for the community, and it's kind of like a powerhouse of prayer, so that people could come to you with their concerns. You could pray for people who were sick or for people who had died, and you were very influential in your community, actually. So Julian of Norwich she had vivid visions, and she wrote a long book describing them. And her book is called Showings in English. Well, she wrote in English, but she wrote in Middle English, so it would have been Shewings. Anyway, she was a very famous figure in her day. Among other things, she was famous for the teaching that God's love is more powerful than our sin. So one of her famous quotes is, all will be well, and all manner of thing will be well. So don't get too upset about the Black Death, which occurred during her lifetime, so deaths, illnesses, wars. Don't get too upset about that, because it's all going to be okay. God knows about you and your griefs, and God will care for you, and kind of in the afterlife you will be safe and secure with the one who created you. So the other thing that she's famous for is part of her text in which she discusses God as our mother, not just our father. She also sees Jesus on the cross as very similar to a mother in certain ways. And so I'll read you some of her passages that present those concepts. So this is from Shewings, chapter 59. She says, so Jesus Christ, who opposes good to evil, is our true mother. We have our being from him, where the foundation of motherhood begins, with all the sweet protection of love, which endlessly follows. As truly as God is our Father, so truly is God our mother. And I'll skip some of her writings. She says, again, as truly as God is our Father, so truly is God our mother. About Jesus, she explains, and so Jesus is our true mother in nature by our first creation. And he is our true mother in grace by his taking our created nature. Then she says, not only is Jesus our mother in nature and our mother in grace, like giving us eternal life, in the same way that a human mother gives physical life, she says he is these things because he wanted altogether to become our mother in all things. He began the foundation of his work most humbly and mildly in the maiden's womb. When you consider the three parts of the Trinity, she says, so the creator portion of the Trinity, the incarnate part, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, she says, Jesus is the mother. Jesus is the mother's service is the nearest, readiest, and surest. Nearest because it is most natural, readiest because it is most loving, surest because it is truest. She says, Jesus is like a mother because God the Creator is a little distant, the Holy Spirit you can't touch, but Jesus on earth was close to us in the same way that a mother is close to her children. Then she says, we know that all our mothers bear us for pain and even for death. But our true mother, Jesus, he alone bears us for joy and for eternal life. She says, the mother can give her child to suck of her milk, but our precious mother, Jesus, can feed us with himself. So she's talking about the Eucharist or the communion, where we eat the body and blood of Jesus. And she says, we eat from Jesus in the same way that a child is nourished from its mother. Then she says, the mother can lay her child tenderly to her breast, but our tender mother Jesus can easily lead us into his blessed breast through his sweet open side and show us there a part of the Godhead and of the joys of heaven with inner certainty of endless bliss. So on the cross, Jesus had a wound in his side, and she says that we enter through that the same way that a child nurses from the mother. Anyway, she says other things like, as the child grows in age and stature, she acts differently, the mother does, but she does not change her love, and that's the same thing with Jesus and with God as a mother. Anyway, so she goes on in various chapters with this metaphor of God being our mother as well as our father. So she's not the first to do that. Bernard of Clairvaux and others had also pointed out the ways in which God is like a mother to us, but she's well known for that metaphor as well. So Julian of Norwich, the anchoress. Let's go now to Christine de Pizan across the channel in France. So she's from Pisano, Italy. She's actually born in Venice, Italy, in the year 1363. She dies in 1429. She's a wonderful figure to know about. She was essentially Italian. Her father was very well educated, both a doctor and an astrologer, and worked for the royalty. Her father became advisor to King Charles V of France, so they moved from Venice to Paris, and she was raised in Paris because her father was working there. She was married at age 15, which was typical, to another educated man who was a royal secretary in the king's household. They had 3 children. However, her husband died when she was 25 years old and had 3 children. She also had her mother to care for and support. Her father had already died. So here she is, 25 years old, and she has to somehow provide for her children and her mother. So she did what she was raised to do, what she knew best. She started out copying books and also writing poems to earn a living. So the writing out of manuscripts was one way to earn money. And then she thought, well, I'm doing a lot of copying and writing and thinking I might as well be writing some poems. Maybe I can give a poem to a certain lord or lady and be rewarded for it. So she started writing poems of courtly love, and also she started writing about the sorrows of being a widow. However, she encountered some literature which was very misogynistic. It had hatred of women in it. One of these works was the second half of a famous work called the Roman de la Rose, so the Romance of the Rose. She started writing back in defense of women and got very involved in the problem of women's roles in society. She ended up writing 2 books that focused on this issue. One is called The City of Ladies, and it's about famous women who did good things in history. And another is called The Book of the 3 Virtues. It's addressed to women on how to use the opportunities that are available to them. She wrote several other books. She wrote her own autobiography. She wrote a poem celebrating the victory of Joan of Arc in Orleans. So this is all early 15th century, the 1400s. So she lived at the same time as Joan of Arc. She was interested in her achievements and wrote a poem for her. That's pretty exciting. She was the first woman to earn a living by writing. Now I'm going to read you a little bit from the Book of the City of Ladies by Christine de Pizan. So this is the opening of the book. She says, one day, as I was sitting alone in my studies, surrounded by books on all kinds of subjects, devoting myself to literary studies, as my usual habit, my mind dwelt at length on the weighty opinions of various authors whom I have studied for a long time. I looked up from my book and decided to relax by reading some light poetry. I searched for some small book. By chance, a strange volume came into my hands. I picked it up and saw that it was written by Matteolus. I smiled because, though I had never seen this book before, I'd often heard that, like other books, it discussed the issue of respect for women. I thought I would browse through it to amuse myself. I had not been reading for very long when my good mother called me to refresh myself with some supper. This is such a great scene. She's working in her study, writing, supporting the family. Her mother's cooking, calls her in to supper. She says, for it was evening. Intending to look at this book the next day, I put it down. The next morning, seated again in my study, as was my habit, I went to examine this book by Matteolus. I started to read it. Then she says, because the subject seemed to me not very pleasant for people who do not enjoy lies, and of no use in developing virtue or manners, given its lack of integrity in diction and theme, after browsing here and there and reading the end, I put it down in order to turn my attention to more elevated and useful study. But just the sight of this book, even though it was of no authority, made me wonder how it happened that so many different men, and learned men among them, have been and are so inclined to express, both in speaking and in their treatises and writings, so many wicked insults about women and their behavior. So she then gets on this subject, and she says, it seems that they all speak from one and the same mouth. They all concur in one conclusion, that the behavior of women is inclined to and full of every vice. Thinking deeply about these matters, I began to examine my character and conduct as a natural woman, and similarly I considered other women whose company I frequently kept, princesses, great ladies, women of the middle and lower classes, who had graciously told me of their most private and intimate thoughts, hoping that I could judge impartially and in good conscience she wanted to judge whether the testimony of so many notable men could be true. So here we have a woman in the early 1400s having two courses to knowledge. One is to take an authority figure, and the figure tells you what women are like or what you should believe, and to just say, yes, oh, because you speak from authority and from other writers who agree with you, that must be right. The other course to knowledge is to do an inductive survey of different women that you know and of yourself, and to say, well, as I look at this person and this person and this person, is it really true what these authorities say, that all women are bad in various ways? And so she's basically doing a very Renaissance activity. So she's this is the beginning of the Renaissance in Italy, and certainly in France, and certainly in Italy too. The examination of individual cases and the reasoning to make inductive conclusions rather than just take a truth and come down to a particular case in the deductive process of thinking. So anyway, she says, to the best of my knowledge, no matter how long I confronted or dissected the problem, I could neither see nor realize how their claims could be true when compared to the natural behavior and character of women. Yet I still argued vehemently against women, saying that it would be impossible that so many famous men, such solemn scholars, possessed of such deep and great understanding, so clear-sighted in all things, impossible that they could have spoken falsely on so many occasions, that I could hardly find a book on morals where, even before I had finished it, I did not find several chapters or certain sections attacking women, no matter who the author was. So this reason alone made me conclude that although my intellect did not perceive my own great faults, nor those of other women, it must be my own simpleness and ignorance. So I relied more on the judgment of others than on what I myself felt and knew. I was so transfixed in this line of thinking for such a long time that it seemed as if I were in a stupor. She says, I finally decided that God formed a vile creature when God made woman, and I wondered how such a worthy artisan could have deigned to make such an abominable work, which, from what they say, is the vessel as well as the refuge and abode of every evil and vice. As I was thinking this, a great unhappiness and sadness welled up in my heart, for I detested myself and the entire feminine sex, as though we were monstrosities in nature. And in my lament I spoke these words, "O God, how can this be? For unless I stray from my faith, I must never doubt that your infinite wisdom and most perfect goodness I must never doubt that your infinite wisdom ever created anything which was not good. Did you not yourself create woman in a very special way? And since that time, did you not give her all those inclinations which you pleased for her to have? Yet look at all these accusations which have been judged, decided, and concluded against women. I do not know how to understand this. If it is so that in fact so many abominations abound in the female sex, why should I not doubt it? Alas, God, why did you not let me be born in the world as a man, so that all my inclinations would be to serve you better, so that I would not stray in anything, and would be as perfect as man is said to be?" So she's worrying and writing about this. She says, "In my folly, I considered myself most unfortunate, because God had made me inhabit a female body in this world." So her next chapter says, "So, occupied with these painful thoughts, my head bowed in shame, my eyes filled with tears, leaning on my chair's armrest, I suddenly saw a ray of light fall on my lap, as though it were the sun. I shuddered as if awakened from sleep, for I was sitting in a shadow where the sun could not have shone at that hour. And as I lifted my head to see where this light was coming from, I saw 3 crowned ladies standing before me, and the splendor of their bright faces shone on me and throughout the entire room." So then she talks about being afraid and making the sign of the cross, and how the first one says to her, "Dear daughter, do not be afraid, for we have not come here to harm you or trouble you, but to console you." And basically these 3 ladies turn out to be Lady Reason, Lady Rectitude, and Lady Justice. And these 3 ladies tell her that she's absolutely right, that women are not as bad as these authorities are saying that they are, and that they want her to believe in herself and believe in all the good women that have existed, and they want her to write a book about all the good women. So she writes this book, the Book of the City of Ladies. And she writes it with the metaphor of women building a city, and each woman making her contribution. And she goes through history and records biblical women, women in Roman history and in Greek history, and all these women who have done good things and accomplished things and been virtuous women. And so anyway, she ends up writing this whole book, and these women have come to support her. And they say, "We 3 ladies whom you see here, moved by pity, have come to you to announce a particular edifice built like a city wall, which has been predestined and established by our aid and counsel for you to build. And no one will reside here except all ladies of fame, women worthy of praise, for the walls of the city will be closed to those women who lack virtue." Anyway, so Christina Pizan then becomes part of the querelle des femmes, the quarrel over women. You know, are women good, are women bad? and what are the rights and abilities of women and opportunities. So she's a wonderful figure. You need to know about Christine de Pizan. We have two more women to talk about who are important in the 1400s, and they are Marjorie Kemp and Joan of Arc. So we've already talked about Julian of Norwich, who died in 1413, and Christine de Pizan, who died in 1429. So let's now look at their contemporary, Marjorie Kemp, who was born in 1373 and probably died around 1439. We don't know for sure. So she's 30 years younger than Julian of Norwich, and they actually met each other. Marjorie Kemp ran into some problems trying to be a religious woman in the church as a woman who was already married and had some unusual activities that got her in trouble with the church. So at one point in her life, she went to Christine, the anchoress, who lived not too far from her in England. And she appeared at her window and said, Julian, I'm sorry, did I say Christine? She went to Julian of Norwich and said, Sister Julian, please advise me. These are the experiences I've had. This is the opposition I've run into. Do you think that what I'm doing is in line with God's will and is good? Or do you think that, as they say, that I'm probably not honest and making this up and maybe in line with evil rather than good? And so Julian kindly listened to her accounts and determined that she could give her stamp of approval. She said, you know, you're doing the right thing. You are having visions and experiences with God, and this should be recognized by all. So that was very helpful to Marjorie Kemp. She got more standing and less danger because she got Julian of Norwich's seal of approval. But anyway, let's find out about who Marjorie of Kemp was. So she was the first person, male or female, to write an autobiography in English. This was an important step in the development of the individual. For someone to sit down and say, my life is important enough for me to take time and resources and have assistance in writing the whole story of my life. So she wrote a book that's actually about this big, as translated into English and in print. So it must have been even much bigger as a manuscript. This is how her life went. She married at age 20. She became the mother of 14 children. So basically, in medieval terms, she was not material for being a religious, important woman of any kind. She could never be a saint because she had already had sexual intercourse and she'd been married, and she just hadn't followed the right course of pattern for a saint type of career. At age 40, however, she began to have visions and spiritual experiences. Her children were mostly raised, and she wanted to be a holy woman, to live a celibate life. And she first had to persuade her husband to agree to it. So she gives an account in her book of how she tried to get him to agree to it and how he finally did. She sobs and cries out during church services. So she has visions of Jesus on the cross when the priest is celebrating the Mass and making the bread and wine into God's body and blood. And he may be up there being important and conducting his service, but she's even more important because she's actually seeing Jesus on the cross. And it's such a powerful experience for her that she's sobbing and crying out. And people have all their attention on her, not on the priest. So she essentially was setting up her own a rival situation for the attention of others in the worship service. And she was not popular with the church for doing this. She ended up having a very successful career as a holy woman, being recognized, and she traveled to Jerusalem 3 times. Think what that meant in the 1400s to travel from England to the Holy Land. She went partly by foot, partly on horse, partly on ship, and she went traveling with various groups of pilgrims. She had many adventures and near disasters. But so her account of those travels is interesting in and of itself. At many times she was in danger of execution as a heretic, but partly because of the approval of Julian of Norwich and because of her own careful managing of politics within the church, of getting advice from this bishop or archbishop and support from this person, she manages to avoid getting executed the way the Beguines had just a century earlier. I'm now going to read you just a little bit from the beginning of her book as translated into modern English. She wrote in medieval English, which is not too far different from what we speak today. But I want to read you a little bit of chapter 1, which will introduce her personality to you. She writes, instead of saying the word I, she says this creature. So it would have been incredibly, well, it was incredibly egotistic to write a book about yourself. Still is considered, well, who are you to write an autobiography or a memoir? But in the 1400s, it was even more egotistic. So she writes, when this creature, which emphasizes that she's God's creature, and she's not using I, me, and my, she says, when this creature was 20 years of age, or somewhat more, she was married to a worshipful burgess businessman of Lynn, England, and was with child within a short time, as nature would have it. After she had conceived, she was troubled with severe attacks of sickness until the child was born. And then, what with the labor pains she had in childbirth and the sickness that had gone before, she despaired of her life, believing she might not live. Then she sent for her confessor, for she had a thing on her conscience which she had never revealed before that time in all her life. And we don't know what this thing is that she had not confessed, that she felt she had to confess before she died, or she might be damned. So the devil she says, the devil said in her mind that she should be damned, for she had not confessed that fault. So after her child was born, and not believing she would live, she sent for her confessor. When she came to the point of saying that thing which she had so long concealed, her confessor was a little too hasty, and began to sharply reprove her before she had fully said what she meant. And so she would say no more, in spite of anything he might do. And soon after, because of the dread she had of damnation on the one hand, and his sharp reproving of her on the other, this creature went out of her mind. So she's essentially saying, so I went crazy with guilt and anxiety. She was amazingly disturbed and tormented with spirits for half a year, 8 weeks and odd days. And in this time she saw, as she thought, devils opening their mouths, all alight with burning flames of fire, as if they would have swallowed her in, sometimes pawing at her, sometimes threatening her, sometimes pulling her, and hauling her about both day and night during this time. And the devils called out to her with great threats, and bade her that she should forsake her Christian faith and belief, and deny her God, and his mother, and all the saints in heaven, her good works and all good virtues, deny her father, her mother, and all her friends. And so she did. She slandered her husband, her friends, and her own self. She spoke many sharp and reproving words. So she's describing this hysterical behavior that she had. Nowadays, we might consider this, since it occurred right after her first childbirth, we might consider it kind of a postpartum depression. At any rate, we don't know for sure, but she then writes, when she had long been troubled by these and many other temptations, so that people thought she should never have escaped from them alive, then one time, as she lay by herself, and her keepers were not with her, our merciful Lord Jesus Christ, ever to be trusted, worshipped be his name, never forsaking his servant in time of need, Jesus appeared to his creature who had forsaken him. He appeared in the likeness of a man, the most seemly, the most beauteous, and most amiable of all that ever might be seen with man's eye, clad in a mantle of purple silk, sitting upon her bedside, looking upon her with so blessed a countenance that she was strengthened in all her spirits. And he said to her these words, Daughter, why have you forsaken me? And I never forsook you. As soon as he had said these words, she saw truly how the air opened, as bright as any lightning, and he ascended up into the air, not hastily and quickly, but beautifully and gradually, so that she could clearly behold him in the air until it closed up again. And presently the creature grew as calm in her wits and her reason as she ever was before, and asked her husband as soon as he came to her if she could have the keys to the buttery to get her food and drink, as she had done before. Her maids and her keepers advised him that he should not deliver any keys to her, for they said she would only give away such goods as there were, because she did not know what she was saying, as they believed. Nevertheless, her husband, who always had tenderness and compassion for her, ordered that they should give her the keys. And she took food and drink, as her bodily strength would allow her. And she once again recognized her friends and her household, and everybody else who came to see her, in order to see how our Lord Jesus Christ had worked his grace in her. Blessed may he be, who ever is near those in tribulation. When people think he is far away from them, he is very near through his grace. And afterwards, this creature performed all her responsibilities wisely and soberly enough, except that she did not truly know our Lord's power to draw us to him. So that's the very first chapter of her book. She goes on to describe how she wanted to wear white clothes, but only nuns and people of a certain status in the church could wear white clothes. And she wanted to be approved and allowed to attend church and to have communion, and the church was not so sure about this freelance holy woman. She talks about her travels to Jerusalem. Anyway, wonderful, interesting person, the first person to write her own autobiography in English in the 1400s in England. The last person that we'll mention as we complete our 1,000-year survey of women in medieval Christianity is, of course, Joan of Arc. So Joan was born in 1413 in France. She died in 1431, burned at the stake. She had visions and voices. The voices were from St. Margaret, from St. Catherine, and the angel Michael. And these voices led her to become a military leader for France against England. She was actually illiterate, as was Marjorie Kemp. Marjorie had to have someone else write down her chapters as she dictated them. But Joan of Arc was illiterate, but thanks to the long trials that she endured in the last 6 months of her life, we have much of her life story, because someone was sitting there with pen and paper writing down in Latin everything that was said during the trial. So we have some wonderful records of what her visions were like and of why she did the things she did. This is a book by Marina Warner about Joan of Arc. It's called The Image of Female Heroism. One of the most controversial things of Joan of Arc that got her into trouble was that she decided to wear armor and to give up women's clothing. So cross-gender dressing in the 15th century was a very dangerous thing to do. It got you in a lot of trouble. And she said, it wasn't my idea. My voices told me, put on men's armor and go out there and battle and defend France against England. They were in a long war. And, but they didn't believe. They said, Satan must have told you this. God would not tell a woman to not wear a dress. This is clearly what Satan would have a woman do. It was when she was, the time when she went to trial was when she was captured by the English, and they're the ones who put her to trial and who ultimately executed her. The French could have ransomed her. She worked so hard for Charles, the Dauphin, to become the actual king of France and to govern his own land. But did he ransom her, pay money to rescue her from the English? No. She was dispensable. She was a poor peasant girl. She died at about age not even 20 years old, more like 18 or 19, we're not sure exactly about the records of the exact dates of her age. But she did not get ransomed. The execution was carried out, but very soon afterward, people started honoring her and believing that she was not a witch and not inspired by Satan, but actually called by God and in touch with God, getting her voices and her visions. So that's a very brief introduction to women in Christianity in the medieval period. Thank you.